Hey y'all, it's Leah from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. We are looking at some beautiful gooseberries that we picked off of a very prolific bush yesterday. And I was reminded of something as we were doing this. You see all this white stuff on the skin of the gooseberries? That white stuff is wild yeast that is in the air. You'll see the same thing on grapes. And what's cool about that is you can use this yeast to make a sourdough starter, which is what you use for making sourdough bread. Regular breads use regular yeast. Usually you can get this in a package or a jar, but sourdough is a living organism. The natural yeasts that are in the sourdough starter, they actually eat the flour and the sugars and they ferment the flour, and that's what allows it to bubble up and rise. It's a living organism. So you can use grapes, and in this case I'm going to try gooseberries to make sourdough starter. So I thought I'd do a little experiment with this and bring you along. The procedure is very simple. I am in no way an expert baker. There was a period of my life where I was making bread a lot, but I haven't done it in a few years, and it does take some practice, and we'll see how this goes. This is just to make the starter. This is a multi-day process, and this is just the beginning. So I just looked up some information about how to make a sourdough starter with grapes. The best thing, well, you need to use grapes or gooseberries that are not washed because you need that yeast that's on the skin. You can use organic grapes from some other location, but a local yeast would really be your best bet, because that will probably help keep your sourdough going because it's colonized with a local yeast that's already in the air. Do not use conventional grapes, because then you will have pesticide in your sourdough starter and forever in all the bread that you make with that sourdough starter. So you don't want to do that. So just look this up, and this is very, very simple. This would just be day one, and all you need to do is take some of these and put them in cheesecloth. Oop, I have a runaway. I'm not real clear on the amounts that are needed, but we'll just try a few of these because I'm only going to make a small amount. And I think this is probably plenty, so I'm just going to tie it up here. You could use kitchen twine if you want. And then you're actually just going to crush this a bit, and that'll release some of the juice, and the sugars in the juice will help the whole process. You don't have to use cheesecloth here. You could make this starter with just the gooseberries or grapes and then strain them out later, but I'm going to try the cheesecloth. Okay, I'm going to set that aside for a minute, and then you're just going to make a flour paste. So I'm using a cup of flour. I'm using whole wheat flour. You can use white flour as well, and a cup of water. So generally the rule of thumb with sourdough is equal parts water and flour to make this slurry. Actually, you know what? I will be right back. I think based on the size of this jar, I'm actually going to maybe triple the amount of flour and water. And I might add some extra water because this looks kind of thick. I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So I just added 2 more cups of water. So I'm going to add, I think, 2 more cups of flour, but let's see how we do here. That was cup 1. And this is cup 2. Now, you do want to get the lumps of flour out, so a whisk will help. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more water. This is rather thick. You do not want to use chlorinated water because that will kill the yeast. So if you have tap water that has chlorine in it, you would want to filter that because it will affect the yeast. I also like, with stuff like this, if I'm making bread or kefir, if you know what that is, that's a fermented milk product. I like to avoid using metal utensils unless they're stainless steel, because sometimes that can affect the pH and then affect any microbial growth that you need. Okay, that looks about to be the right thickness. This is not an exact science, but literally at this point, and hopefully this is enough gooseberry, I am just going to drop this cheesecloth in here. So you've got the sugars going and the yeast in here. I may very well do another cheesecloth sack with some more gooseberries. But, so this is just day one. This is going to need to go for probably about 6 days. I'm going to put a lid on this. I'm not going to close it too tightly, so that there's some oxygen in there. Literally going to let this sit and mix it up tomorrow again, see what's happening with the cheesecloth. So this may very well take 6 or 7 days. But eventually we should have a nice starter, and at that point we'll feed it with flour and water again. Starters need to be fed on a regular basis because they are living organisms. You can put them in the refrigerator and they will kind of go somewhat dormant. It'll slow the growth and that'll require less feeding. But if you make bread every day, you would just leave your starter out on the counter at room temperature. So we'll see what happens. Come back later. Okay, take care. Bye. Okay, so we're still in the first 24 hours of the gooseberry yeast to make sourdough starter experiment. Couldn't quite wait to check on it. So you can see that the liquid is separating from the flour, which is totally normal and fine. I'm actually going to stir it back up again. I don't see a tremendous amount of change yet, but it is early. There's a little bit of bubbling going on, and I have stirred this a couple of times. It smells kind of bready, slightly yeasty. It should start developing a sour flavor. Might see some more progress during the day today as it warms up. So we'll see what happened. I'm just gonna mix it up a little bit. You can see I did put another bag of gooseberries in here. I decided that I made a fair amount of starter, so some more gooseberry yeast might be helpful. But we will see if this wakes up and comes alive. Check again later. See ya. Okay, so we're about at the 24-hour mark making this sourdough starter, and it definitely looks like something is happening. You've got all that nice bubbliness in there. I actually did just stir this up, and it's continuing to bubble, and that's a great sign. It tells me that this is active and the yeast is eating the flour. So it still has a very bready smell. It does not have a sour smell yet, but that should develop along the way. The liquid was separated again from the flour, although I just stirred it, so the separation is minimal at the moment, and that will continue to happen, and that's totally fine. Another way that we can kind of tell that this is active is that this is actually generating some heat. So if I put my hand down in here, I can actually feel some heat rising. So we know it's active and alive, so that's very good. This is my first time doing it, so you're following my journey. This may be the first time you've seen this done. So hopefully this will be a success. Should take about 6 days. And hopefully we have a good sourdough starter to make bread with. Alright, later. We'll check in again tomorrow. So here we are on day 2, and you can see there's a change here. The liquid is now in the middle. There's flour at the top and flour at the bottom. I sort of started noticing this last night, as it's like there was a skin created on top. I can also see that the flour on the top looks particularly bubbly, like it looks spongy. So definitely some change here. There's definitely been a lot of activity foaming and bubbling from the top, and it looks like this is real spongy and thick right here. So obviously this is the starter forming here. I'm mixing this up because this will give the yeast a chance to eat the flour that's on the bottom that hasn't been processed yet. At least that's what I'm guessing is happening. Look how foamy and bubbly that is. That's awesome. I've seen some references to noticing that the bag of cheesecloth, the cheesecloth bag of grapes, is deflating in some tutorials I watched, and I can't really observe that here. I think my bags are just too small for that. Plus they're covered in flour. But definitely some progress. Still smells pretty bready, but it does smell slightly sour now. So this is pretty exciting. We'll check it again later. Bye. So here we are on day 3. Unlike yesterday, the liquid is back at the top rather than in the middle. I don't know what that means. It's just an observation. This definitely does have a sour smell at this point, and it continues to generate heat. Having some camera focus problems. I did actually feed this a bit yesterday. I put in a half a cup of flour, and I did that because it seemed so active and warm that I was thinking maybe the flour, was being depleted somewhat. But when I stir this up, it definitely does still have a fair amount of foaming activity. And I've been stirring this a couple times a day to distribute the food for the yeast. I am excited about the sour smell. I'm actually kind of wondering if I should cut this short of the 6 days, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to look into that a little bit. But that's where we're at. We'll check in again tomorrow. This is day 4. I have liquid on the top still. Now this could mean that I've let this go too far, or not long enough. But I think that we're fine because this mixture seems to be very active. It's been generating lots of heat, and it definitely smells sour. Now, there are clearly a lot of instructions out there about the right way to do this, and I don't think there's any hard and fast rules because I'm seeing lots of different advice. Some people say that you should remove the grapes after 3 days. Some people say you should leave them in there the whole time. Some people say you shouldn't feed this until 3 days. Some people say otherwise. So I think going with your instinct is the best bet here. However, I am today going to remove, in this case, the gooseberries, not the grapes. So I'm going to remove these cheesecloth bags. This is kind of messy, obviously. Another piece of advice that I'm seeing online is at this point, after the 3-day mark, and some people say, by the way, not to touch this for 3 days, to just let it sit and do its thing. I didn't. I definitely stirred it, and I also did feed this mixture a couple of times. But one thing I am seeing is the recommendation to discard half of this. at this point and then feed it again. That's also usually a piece of advice just for maintaining a sourdough, that every time you feed it, you would discard about half of the mixture. So I'm going to put these cheesecloth bags of gooseberries aside. And I'm mixing this right now simply because I'm going to remove half, and it would be nice to have kind of an even amount of liquid and flour left. So I think I'm just going to pour this out. You can save this starter mixture and use it to make other things. Sourdough crackers, maybe something else. Okay, that looks to be about half. And I'm also going to thicken this a bit. So I'm going to try to sort of get back to a 1-to-1 flour-water ratio. Right now, I'm going to put in half a cup of flour, because if I remember correctly, that's about where I left off in terms of getting myself back to a 50-50 ratio here. See how I do with this. See how thick it is. It's a little hard to see because there's a lot of sort of steam in the jar. I'm going to add another 1/4 cup here and see how that looks. This is totally approximate. An exact perfect ratio is not critical at this juncture. While making actual bread, the moisture to flour ratio is pretty critical, but we're not making bread right now. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to add just a smidgen of water, maybe a smidgen more flour, just kind of freshen it up a little bit. And remember, try not to use chlorinated water, because that can apparently affect the fermentation. Okay, that is now a little wetter than I'd like. And maybe a smidgen more flour. Actually, no, we'll leave that be. Okay, so now we're going to let this sit again, and we'll see how this develops, and we'll keep feeding this. I think I'm going to keep the sourdough starter that I discarded in the fridge and see if I can't make something out of that later. And I'll probably be discarding parts of this again later, so I'll just keep adding to that, and then maybe I can utilize that. So we'll come back later and see how this did. Progress to be seen. This is now the second half of day 4. And you can see that we definitely still have bubbling action going on, so that's very good. I am going to feed this again, and I believe that I read recommendations to feed morning and night while you're still in this process, but I definitely want to do it because it is really, really warm in here. It gets very warm in here during the day. Today, the high inside was 84. So the warmer it is, the faster yeast is going to eat and ferment the flour. It's the same concept as when you have a sourdough starter. If you can store it in the fridge, and it will slow down the growth and kind of sort of go dormant. It will still be alive. But if you leave your starter out on the counter, which you would really only do if you're making bread really frequently, like every day or every other day, if you leave it out on the counter, you absolutely need to feed it every day because it is a living organism. So I am going to feed this, and I'm still a little bit on the moist side in here, so I'm going to add this flour first. That was probably about 2/3 of a cup, and I'm going to see how this thickness is. And that's fine if this is kind of thick. There is such a thing called a wet starter, and to be quite honest with you, I don't really remember what qualifies as a wet starter, like how wet that would be. But I think I'm gonna not add any more water right now and kind of see how this does and how this develops overnight. It's definitely sort of back to smelling a bit bready, but it still has a sour smell to it. Plus, you know, you'll sort of see some slowdown in foaminess when you feed, and that's just, it just takes a little bit of time for that activity to kind of pick up again. So, okay, so this is really, I think this is probably about as thick as I would want it myself. But you can see that it's kind of stretchy, and that is, you know, to some degree that's some gluten developing. And we'll see how spongy this gets. So we'll check it again in the morning and see where we're at. And in the morning, when I feed, I will probably again remove half of this starter. I maybe should have done it now, but I'm not really that concerned about it. So I'll do that in the morning. Okay, we'll check in again on day 5. It is day 5, and the starter is looking nice and bubbly. So today I'm just going to remove half of this and then feed it with a cup of flour and a cup of water, even parts. And I think I may just do this for the next couple of days. I'll do a little bit more reading to see how long I should keep doing that to kind of really get this established. But I think we're pretty much there. It smells great. It smells sour. Diamond was here when I opened this container last night, and he said, "Whoa, that smells like beer, kind of." So that's about right. That's definitely a good sign. We'll check in again later. Sourdough starter looks fantastic. It's nice and bubbly. I can see that the top of it is very airy and kind of expanding. You probably can't tell that from this video, but I can see that. It smells great. It tastes sour. I did feed this last night. I emptied half of this, and then I added another cup of flour and another cup of water. I actually added a little bit more flour than that just to thicken it a bit more. I'm going to feed it again, and I'll probably do that twice today. I may do it tomorrow, but I might also, at this point, refrigerate this starter because I am not ready to make bread right now. I got a million other things going on, and I don't have time. But I am really happy with the results of this experiment. I'll try to post some links for information about making sourdough starter. This is a really cool experiment. This is my first time doing this. I'm really pleased with the results. Pretty exciting. While I got the yeast from the skins of the gooseberries that we have, you can also harvest yeast out of the air. You don't have to use grapes or gooseberries, but this is just a more direct way of doing it. So harvesting out of the air is one way to do it. Grapes are another. Again, a local yeast is best, but you could use store-bought organic grapes, unwashed, and get the yeast off of those, and that would be fine. This is just more exciting because it is the local yeast that's already in the air colonizing this starter, and I imagine that that would improve the health of the starter, kind of like how local honey will do wonders for your allergies. Honey from the location where you're at. Local is always the best thing. Okay, I am so pleased with this. Very excited. I hope you are too, and maybe you'll try making a sourdough starter. Just to wrap things up, here is my starter on day 7. Yesterday, twice, in the morning and in the evening, I discarded half and then doubled the amount of starter, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And I did that again this morning. I've let it develop for a few hours, and now I'm going to put it in this jar and store it in the refrigerator. And I'm storing mine in the refrigerator because I am not ready to make bread. I like using these jars because starter does produce carbon dioxide gas, and that gas pressure could build up and cause your container to explode. But because of this gasket and the hinged lid, if the gas pressure does build up, it'll kind of push the lid up a little bit and let those gases escape. Some people say that you should not use a totally sealed container because of the lack of oxygen. I have never had an issue with that. However, if you're concerned about it, you could just remove the gasket entirely, and then that will let some oxygen in there. So every time you feed your starter, you are going to discard at least half and then double the amount. So what that means is if I am left with 1 cup of starter after discard, I will then add 1 cup of flour and 1 cup of water. Now there's a couple of reasons why you discard part of the starter. Number 1, it helps maintain the acidity of the starter, which will then help keep the colony of bacteria and yeast healthy. And number 2 is that because every time you discard and you have to double the amount, you would very quickly end up with an overwhelming amount of starter. So those are the couple of reasons to do that. There are some uses for discarded sourdough starter. You can make other things that don't require a lot of leavening, like crackers, pizza dough, pancakes, waffles, etc. There's tons of recipes out there, and I'll try to include some links about that. Note also, I mentioned this before, but if you make bread on a regular basis, like several times a week, you can leave your starter out at room temperature on the counter. You would just have to feed it every day, and that includes the discarding. If you don't make bread that often, you can store your starter in the fridge, and you'd want to feed it about once a week. Also, you can actually freeze starter, and it will preserve those microorganisms, and then take it out and thaw it out and feed it again and wake it up. I would only do that if I don't know, was making bread just a couple of times a year, and even then I might not do that. I might still store it in the refrigerator. Now, if you are storing your starter in the refrigerator, you would want to take it out probably a day ahead and feed it, give it a chance to warm up and reactivate, because it will be somewhat dormant in the refrigerator, not entirely. And likewise with the freezer, if you stored your starter in the freezer, you would want to take it out a couple of days ahead of time, let it thaw out, feed it, let it reactivate. Also, you would feed the starter right before you make bread. So you would feed it twice before you're ready to make bread. Once after you take it out of the refrigerator, and once right before you make bread. I think that covers the majority of the sourdough starter basics. I'm very happy with the results of my experiment, and thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and take care.